Alright, so today I want to show you how to make an all black ball python. And when it comes to black snakes, there's really only a handful of ways that you can actually produce one versus a white snake. As a matter of fact, I actually counted the number of ways you can make an all white ball python, and there's over 40 different ways you can make a white snake. And I actually saw this guy breeding on a level where he had warehouses full of ball pythons, and you get kind of a better feel for all the genetics and everything when you're breeding on a larger scale. And he actually said that every time he produced an all black snake, that it was a lot more aggressive than any of his other ball pythons, that he got bit a lot more from his black snakes. But it's just, pretty much for ball pythons, they go through that transition of when they hatch out of the egg, they don't really bite anything until you get them to eat, and then they go through this phase where they just bite everything like crazy. And I've actually found certain morphs have a higher tendency to bite a lot more than others. As a matter of fact, the bamboos, like the one around my neck, this is Bobby, and when the bamboos are hatchlings and they're growing up kind of immature hatchlings, they tend to really be aggressive feeders, meaning they'll almost bite anything. And it was kind of interesting. Last year I produced double heads albino pieds. I took my albino pied visual male and I bred it to a bunch of normals and actually got some double heads, and it seemed like every single double head that I have was really bitey. It was just biting everything, and it could be the same if you actually produce some of these black snakes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over the internet and I want to show you the few ways that we can actually make an all black ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com, and I want to start with the black pastel. This is what a black pastel looks like, and this is actually one of the components to making one of the blackest snakes that you will find in ball pythons. The black pastel is actually a dark morph, and when it comes to dark morphs, you can actually make the super by breeding two of them together, and in some cases with some of the dark morphs, you'll actually get a completely black snake with no pattern. In some cases, you just get a really dark snake that has some patterns associated with it. And I just kind of wanted to start with the completely patternless all black snakes, and this is probably the ideal case when you actually breed two of these together. So this is what happens when you take two black pastels, breed them together. 25% of the time you get a super black pastel, and I'd say as far as black snakes, this is the ideal black snake that you could, probably as black as you can get in any ball python. And the super black pastel is actually part of the Panda Pied project. I don't know if you've been working on Panda Pieds. It's a pretty awesome project that's kind of hard to hit because it's pied, which is a recessive, and then it's a super with the super black pastel. So essentially you need 4 genes in one snake. Kind of hard to hit if you're actually shooting for the Panda Pied. And essentially what the Panda Pied is, it has splotches of white through the snake that is really sharp definitions between the black and the white. And the only problem with the Panda Pied is a lot of times if you actually hit it, a lot of times you end up with a completely white snake or a really high white snake with just a little black here and there throughout the snake when you're shooting for the Panda Pied. And this one, as a matter of fact, this is actually het pied. So this is super black pastel. Someone is actually shooting for the Panda Pied. As a matter of fact, this is probably pretty expensive. Yes, this one actually sold for $1,450 back in 2018. It's been a couple years. But when it comes to Panda Pieds, the prices are really strong and they don't really come down in price that much, which is pretty amazing. So you can also make a black snake with the cinnamon. This is what the cinnamon looks like. The cinnamon is actually allelic and compatible with the black pastel. So you can actually mix 2 cinnamons together. 25% of the time you actually get a super cinnamon. And this is, I'd say this is probably the next best thing to a super black pastel. A lot of people say there are differences between the black pastel and the cinnamon. The cinnamon, you can definitely tell in the super, it's not quite as jet black as the super black pastel. And you can see in this case it has a little bit of white coming up around the tail. That is what we call a ringer. And a lot of times the ringer is an indication that you actually have het pied in the mix. And I would say it's not always the case. A lot of times when we talk about het pied markers, we mean indications on the snake, visual indications that indicate you have one copy of the recessive pied mutation. But keep in mind the pied's actually recessive, and that pretty much the definition of recessive means we can't see one copy of the pi gene. If we actually could, then it would be considered a codominant mutation, and then the visual pied would be a super. It gets a little bit confusing when you dive into the genetics. But I'd say when it comes to these ringers, sometimes it's actually an indication of het pied, and sometimes it's just a random genetic anomaly. And I'd say with the black snakes, a lot of times I've seen a lot of kind of little splotches here and there of little brown, like little brown circles here and there, or some ringers sometimes coming up around. It's similar to champagne. When you start working champagne into other combos, I'd say the occurrence of ringers around the tail is pretty high, just because of the nature of the champagne, not really because you're actually seeing het pied. So if you actually take cinnamon and breed it to black pastel, 25% of the time, this is what you get. You get an 8-ball, and an 8-ball is almost the same as the last two supers, except it has one copy of the cinnamon, one copy of the black pastel gene. And kind of the problem with all of these snakes is that they tend to have some genetic defects when it comes to the super black pastel or the super cinnamon. Even in the 8-ball, a lot of times you'll have duck billing, which is kind of a genetic anomaly on the mouth. In this case, you can almost see a little bit of duck billing where the mouth is a little bit wider than a normal ball python. And sometimes you get these little weird quirks in some of the snakes, and sometimes it bothers people, and sometimes people think it is extremely cute and they actually go after kind of the unique looking snake. I actually have a snake that is a banana enchy clown, one of my most beautiful snakes in my collection, and it has a kind of a funny looking, funny shaped head, almost like a genetic anomaly. I think it is really cute, just a really cute head compared to all my other ball pythons. So sometimes genetic anomalies may not always be a bad thing. So here's another way you can get a really dark snake using the Mahogany. The Mahogany is another dark morph, and it definitely mixes different than the black pastel or the cinnamon. Makes for some really impressive combos. I actually had a morph special on the Mahogany, and I think it is one of the most amazing dark morphs. Makes some really impressive combos. If you actually take two Mahoganys and cross them together 25% of the time, you get a super Mahogany. And take a look at this. This is called the Suma. As a matter of fact, this is probably one of the darkest Sumas I've seen. Most Sumas are a little bit browner than this, not quite jet black. And people have actually been really working hard with the Super Mahogany to try to mix other genes in with the Super Mahogany to produce an even blacker snake that would rival the Super Black Pastel. Because, you know, when you're talking about the blackest snake on the market, it is the Super Black Pastel. And everybody's trying to reproduce it, but, you know, the Super Black Pastel has the genetic anomalies that people kind of want to try to stay away from, so they're trying to work in with the Super Mahogany. And take a look at this. I think they finally did it. Take a look at this. This is actually a cinnamon Super Mahogany, a cinnamon Suma, and let me tell you, this is probably one of the darkest snakes that I've ever seen. That is probably exactly comparable to the Super Black Pastel. Pretty amazing. And as far as I know, there is no genetic defects with the cinnamon Suma. And the problem is if you actually start working with the cinnamon Suma, it's kind of a catch-22, because you actually have to work with 3 genes here, and if you actually work it into like pied or something like that, then now you're working with 5 genes, which is exponentially harder than working with 4 genes. Trying to hit that would be pretty hard odds, actually trying to make like a cinnamon Suma pied or something like that. You can do it. This is a good alternative, but you know, the more genes you add to the mix, the harder it is to actually make the final product. So here is the GHI. The GHI is another dark morph. It's short for gotta have it. Kind of an interesting abbreviation, GHI. And the GHI is a really dark morph, and it really jumbles up the pattern on the sides of the snake. If you actually take 2 GHIs and breed them together, you get a super GHI. And the super GHI looks like this. It actually has quite a bit of pattern to it, but it's a really dark snake. And as a matter of fact, you can actually take the super GHI as a starting point, mix another gene in, and get a really almost patternless black snake, and it looks like someone's actually done it. Take a look at this. This is the Super GHI Cinnamon, working the cinnamon into the Super GHI, and you almost get a completely black snake. You can tell it's not as black as some of the other ones. It's a little bit more like a goldish color, maybe has a little stripe right down the top. And let me tell you, I'm starting to run out of black snakes already. There's only a limited number of ways you can actually make a completely black snake. So here is the blackhead. I'm kind of straying a little bit from the completely black and patternless snake, but when you're talking about blackheads, it's probably the king of dark morphs as far as, you know, really darkening the background of the snake. If you're looking for a really super dark background, the blackhead is the way to go. And if you actually take two blackheads and breed it together, this is what you get. You get a super blackhead, and I'd say this is probably as dark as you can get without, you know, actually having a completely black snake. There's just a few ways that I covered earlier that is completely black and patternless, and now we're kind of straying away from that. But if you want pretty much the blackest of the black as far as a background to kind of work other projects into, you can work with the super blackhead. So there's one more I kind of wanted to show you. This is actually a black axanthic, another really dark snake, and it really depends on the line of black axanthic. Some of them are kind of dark like this. It's a version of axanthic. Some of them almost look like regular axanthics, and some of them are super dark. I pulled up this last picture here. This is like the blackest black axanthic that I found. The axanthic's actually a recessive mutation, a little bit more difficult to work with. I'd say probably equivalent to working with a super. You still need 2 copies of the gene, but there's not very many ways to get an all black snake, and the VPI black axanthic is one of them. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Amaya Varan asks, how many mice can you keep in a tray in your rodent rack? And that is a very good question. I've been breeding mice for quite a while, and let me tell you, when it comes to mice, there are some tricks. There's some guidelines that you have to follow. When it comes to the male and female ratio, you can only have 1 male per tub or per enclosure when it comes to mice. And I've actually seen some people, you know, trying to kind of flip them at the reptile stores where they have these whole trays full of all these mice, and they're buying mice in bulk, and then they're reselling them. And let me tell you, when you actually do that, the males fight really bad. Sometimes they're really torn up if you go to the pet store and kind of see some of their males and females. Essentially what you really want to do is, if you're actually flipping live mice and buying them and selling them in bulk, what you really want to do is not deal with the males. Maybe feed off all the males and only deal with the females. As a matter of fact, if you have a lot of males that are fighting in an enclosure, they release some kind of pheromone and they get super stinky. As a matter of fact, the first mice that I bought from the reptile store, I bought a few males and a few females, and they're all torn up really bad, and they stunk so bad. It was unbelievable. I was driving home from the reptile store with the rodents right next to me in the truck, and I actually had to pull over and move those rodents in the back of the truck because they were so stinky. It was so bad. And let me tell you, mice are not supposed to be like that. They won't be really stinky if you just keep 1 male and keep them from fighting. And when it kind of gets interesting is your females will actually have some offspring, and the males will start maturing in the litter. And as soon as they start fighting, you know, you have to go through and remove or cull or feed off a lot of those males or get rid of them somehow. So you only end up with 1 adult male per tub. And as far as the number of mice per tub, when it comes to that, essentially what you have to do is, it depends on how often you clean. Is if you're kind of flipping them like in a reptile store kind of a situation, you can keep a whole bunch in there, but you're in there cleaning and replacing the substrate probably every day or every other day. And the fewer that you actually have in there, the more that you can actually let it go and you won't have to clean. And I've pretty much gotten to the point where in my tubs, I'll only have like 1 male and 1 or 2 females per tub, because keep in mind, once the offspring start growing and they have litters of like 16 at a time, you can get a lot of mice in a tub really quick. And I'd probably keep my breeding pairs down to just 1 or 2 females and only 1 male at a time. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.